The Lost Year, Chapter 15, Dancing Master. Arthur frowned into his goblet. It was full of wine, and the red of the liquid did little to flatter the reflection of his dancing master. He'd been learning from her for years. She was ancient. She'd been old for as long as he could remember, with lines so ingrained into her face that it was difficult to imagine her smiling. Madame Rass had been around for as long as most people cared to remember, though no one was old enough to remember what she'd been like when she was young, except maybe Gaius. He hadn't had one of her lessons in months, and he hadn't missed them. When Morgana was taken, Rass had dragged Gwen into the lessons, but apparently she was busy with the seamstress. Hiding from Rass's wrath, more likely. Not that he could blame her. Arthur would love to be hiding from Rass, but he couldn't. There was a nearly tentative knock at the door.
"Enter!"
Rass called, her raspy voice a bit like the sound of metal against metal to Arthur's ears. He finally picked up his goblet, taking a drink before turning to face the door and whatever poor sod the steward had dragged into this mess. Merlin was closing the door behind her by the time Arthur turned on her. Rass advanced on her, circling her like the vulture she so resembled.
"Skinny,"
was her initial assessment. Merlin quirked an eyebrow at Arthur as though asking what this woman was on about. When had he become able to read exactly what she was thinking from the twitch of her eyebrow? He wasn't sure, but he hid a smile behind his goblet. Rass banged her cane on the floor, making them both jump. Merlin eyed the length of wood as though she had been warned about it.
"Do you intend to be drunk for this lesson?"
Rass demanded of Arthur.
"You already dance as though someone switched your feet,"
she railed, and Merlin's eyes lit up as though her every wish had come true all in one moment. Arthur groaned as his maid smiled at Rass. "Oh, I think we're going to get along very well," she said, and Rass turned back to her, giving her a look that would have made anyone else cower, but just made Merlin's smile grow.
"If you're half as good at pulling down this one's ego as they say you are, I'm inclined to agree,"
Rass said, the hint of what might have been a smile pulling at wrinkled lips. Arthur was tempted to lay his head down on the table and give up entirely. The only consolation here was that he would be able to hold Merlin close again. He hadn't been able to do that in a while. That ended up not being the only good part. They were mostly alone. Rass kept a few musicians in the room, enough to keep the feel of what the music would be, without having too many people around. Rass didn't like people, though she seemed to enjoy Merlin well enough. She cackled when Merlin joked about Arthur stepping on her toes, which, while not a total lie, only happened twice. "You're thinking too much, Arthur. Focus on me. Don't think about them," Merlin whispered as he stepped close to her. Her back was to Rass, so she couldn't hear or see. Arthur nodded, just barely. It was easy to take her advice. Sinking into those phenomenally blue eyes had never been hard. Focusing on the feel of her as his hand rested on her waist, her hand in his, watching her skirt swirl as she spun, he grinned as their wrists touched, palm up towards the ceiling. "Never would have expected you to be this light on your feet, Merlin," Arthur joked, for a moment forgetting Rass was even in the room. "I am full of surprises, Arthur," she quipped back. The bang of Rass's cane on the stone floor snapped them back to attention.
"It seems everyone is full of surprises today. That was the closest I've seen to something passable from you, Prince Arthur,"
Rass announced, and Arthur blinked, never having heard anything close to a compliment directed at him from her before.
"Could be better,"
she snapped.
"but perhaps you only needed the right partner."
Merlin grinned at Arthur as the musicians began again, and they began to step in time. He let himself smile. By the time they were done, Merlin was exhausted. She and Arthur sat down at the only table left in the room, Merlin leaning back against it, Arthur with his elbows on his knees. Merlin laughed lightly. And here I thought, knight's training was exhausting exercise, Merlin joked. And Raz thumped her cane again, both of her students too tired to jump this time.
Not bad for a first lesson, girl. Boy, better,
she said simply. She nodded to one of the musicians who ran out of the room, coming back and bowing, speaking for the first time. A servant is on their way with 2 dinners, he confirmed, more to Raz than anyone else in the room. She nodded, banging her cane on the ground again.
We'll meet here for your next lesson 2 days hence. Girl,
she shouted at Merlin, who leapt to her feet on instinct.
See that you're free. This one is much more manageable with you around,
Raz said, and walked out, her cane thunking every other step. Merlin sat back down and Arthur snorted. I can see why the steward is afraid of her, Merlin commented, and Arthur let out a bark of laughter. Merlin looked at him and burst out laughing. That was how Gwen found them when she brought up dinner. Both of them were gasping for breath by that point, and Gwen smiled to see both of them so happy. For a moment, it was as if nothing in the world was wrong.